Welcome to Waterford Property Watch. I'm delighted to chat to you today from Waterford in my grey chair. And today I want to talk to you about Waterford now coming in under the rent pressure zone. It's quite big news this week. We weren't expecting it quite this soon, but it is no surprise. The rate at which rents are rising is, I suppose, a big problem for tenants, and it's not really healthy for our economy, I guess. So just to give you an overview of what it means for Waterford now to be in the pressure zone, I'm going to just read a couple of points about it. Most of this information is actually on the RTB site, and that is a really good reference point for tenants and for landlords. The first point is that the rent pressure zone calculator is basically the Bible for dictating what rents can rise by. So this it isn't optional now. Landlords and agents have to comply with the legislation in terms of calculating the rent increases, okay? So if you log on to rent pressure zone information, all the data is there. And in terms of working out what rent you can charge the tenants, it's all to be calculated on the rent pressure zone calculator. It's predetermined basically. So in the case of a new tenancy in a rent pressure zone, unless the property is exempt, and I'll talk about that in a moment, from the rental restrictions, a landlord is required to provide the tenant in writing with the following information at the beginning of the tenancy: the amount of rent that was last set under a tenancy for the dwelling and the date the rent was last set under a tenancy for the dwelling. So in terms of exemption, very few properties are exempt. If a property has been empty for 2 years, then it's exempt. And I'm sure there's not too many of those. Or if it's had really significant work done, we're not talking about a little mini renovation. But for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to assume that all the properties are not exempt. So in terms of somebody who might be buying a property or going through a closing of a sale for an investment property and they don't know what the rent was, then that rental information is available through the RTB, because all properties have to be registered. And so there is a full history of properties. And if your property isn't registered with the RTB, you need to get it registered. That's really, really important. So when you're renting property now to a tenant, they have to see a calculation of how you've worked out the rent. I think Stevenson's going to put up a graphic here to show you the rent pressure zone calculator and how that would work. So in the example that we're referring to is an apartment here at Glen Cove Apartment in Cove Lane, Waterford. So if you're wondering, right, is your property within the rent pressure zone, you just type in the address and the system straight away recognises if it's within the rent pressure zone. So for this case, this property is in the rent pressure zone and it says yes. Then the agent or the landlord has to fill in the type of tenancy. So if it's a new rental, you put in new and the date previous rent was set. Again, if you don't know that, all that information is with the RTB and the date that the new rent is to take effect from. So the new rent is the new tenant. And the previous rent amount was $1,200. And in this case, the calculator decides that their new rent can be set at €1,252. Is it possible to round that off to €1,260 or decide that, well, I haven't increased it for a long time, should I make it €1,300? The answer is no. The government is really serious about this and they're very, very clear. There is no ambiguity around this. The calculator decides the rent increase and that's it. In terms of then the other information that you need to provide, you have to give 3 comparable properties that have been rented in the last 3 to 4 weeks or that are advertised, okay? So a couple of scenarios here I'm going to start talking about. And if anybody's got any questions, please just put in a message here on the Facebook Live and I'll have a look and see if I can answer them for you. But we chatted, Nora, my colleague, chatted to a landlord yesterday. She has 2 properties in Waterford, one which we rent and manage, and the other one is her son's, and he looks after it himself. In this case, it's a 1-bedroom apartment in the city centre, which is under the rent pressure zone. And the rent that she's charging the tenant for a 1-bedroom is €430 per month. Now, the reason she's charging that, she said, because he's an excellent tenant and he's lovely to deal with, and she's tried to, I suppose, go easy on the rent. Now, from a landlord perspective, the difficult situation here is now legislation is in place. And if she wishes to increase that, we went on the calculator, the rent pressure zone calculator, and it translated that the increase could be made to €476 because the tenant is there 3 years. So we can't round it off to €480. We can't say, well, that's below the market value. In this case, you cannot increase it above what the calculator dictates. Now, do I think this is fair? Not really. This has happened in Dublin as well, but I suppose I've learned one thing in life: there is no point in focusing on what we've no control over. This is law, it's been decided, and if your rents aren't in line with market values, you can only base your rent increase on the previous rent. Okay? Now, in the case that you've issued your tenant with a notice to increase the rent, so previous to the rent pressure zone scenario, we were working on the rent review system. So that meant that every 2 years, the landlord is within the rights to increase the rent to the market value, again providing 3 comparables. So we've had some landlords say, well, look, you've issued rent reviews there 4 weeks ago. How does this impact my property? Well, the rent reviews that were issued prior to the new legislation that came in this week are in fact, I suppose they qualify to continue. They are effective. So in the case where we might have issued a rent increase, issuing the correct notice, which is 90 days. And we always like to give a few days extra to give the tenant comfort and to have had the notice in adequate time. So if the tenant is there 2 years, then the rent in that case was able to be increased with 90 days notice on the anniversary date of the lease. Not 90 days in advance, but 90 days after. So that actually meant that rent reviews weren't happening for 27 to 28 months. So in this case, for this landlord, the rent review was issued in a legal and correct way, and it is effective now from August, and so it's within the former legislation. In terms of the 4% increase, that will not apply for 2 years because the legislation formally takes precedent over the new legislation. So in other words, if you've issued your notice prior to this new legislation, it's still valid, okay? And if you have been below the rental market value, like the lady with the 430 rent, she cannot increase it beyond what the calculation dictates. And most properties will not qualify for exemption, except for there are older properties in the city centre that are idle at the moment, and that will be a good investment opportunity, and they don't come in under the scheme. In terms of locations, the City East and City South, Waterford City East and Waterford City South, are now coming in under the rent pressure zone area. So that includes, but is not specifically only, the Dunmore Road, Faithleg, Ardkeen, Cheek Point, Passage East, Dunmore East, and all the areas around there, okay? And so if you're in doubt, you go on to rent pressure zone calculator and you put in the address and it'll tell you yes or no. In terms of South City Centre, It's all the city centre. And interestingly enough, it does not include, the rent pressure zone does not include Grace Chew, Ferrybank, Orchmore, and West Waterford hasn't come into it either. So again, if you're in doubt, go on to the rent pressure zone calculator. Kilmeaden, for example, I was just checking. Obviously, that's not in the city. It doesn't come in under the zoning. In terms of what's available for rent on the market at the moment, advertised on DAFT today, there are 80 properties for rent. And I think it's fair to say that there's a big portion of those that are student properties, so they're not suitable for families and individuals, etc. And the average one bed is renting at €704, and there are only 11 in the whole city and county now. This is all of Waterford, from Stradbally to Dunmore East to Dungarvan, Waterford City. And 2 beds and 3 beds are the majority properties for rent. 2 beds, €859, and 3 beds, the average rent is just over €1,000. And 4 bedrooms, the average rent is circa €1,100, and there are only 7 of those. 22 3 beds and 34 2 beds. The average rent in Waterford in its entirety is €920 per month. The average number of properties for rent in Limerick is 40 more properties. I'm a little surprised that this came in so soon. We weren't expecting it, but it is what it is. But in Limerick, for example, it came in under the rent pressure zone, and I wasn't surprised because the rents had gone up so high. And in Limerick, the average rent per month is approximately €300 more than Waterford. So what does this mean for landlords? In terms of valuation, so a couple of questions I was asked in the last couple of days is, how will it affect the value of my property? So if you're a landlord with a house on the Dunmore Road where the rental, the rent pressure zone is now in, and you're deciding to sell, I don't believe it's going to impact on the value of your property, because the profile of the buyer is typically couple family. They're not investors. Investors aren't buying houses at the moment in Waterford, in the majority of cases, especially at the over 200,000 mark, because the yields aren't there. So if you own a house on the Dunmore Road and you're renting it, and you decide that I'm going to sell it in the next year or two, will this affect the value of my property? I don't believe so. If you own an apartment and you are the lady who owns the 1-bedroom apartment with the tenant is paying €476, the new rent that will be applied with the rent pressure zone calculation, I do believe it will impact on the value, because if an investor who would be normally the profile of as the buyer is buying that property, then it doesn't make financial sense because the yield is too low, and they are dictated to on an annual basis by the 4%. Unless you're attracting a owner occupied to that 1-bed apartment where it won't impact on them. So they are a couple of the scenarios. It's going to be difficult for landlords, because if you're not abreast with your rent increases and you're way below the market value, then the law now dictates the process in which you increase your rent. And I guess in terms of the actual supply, the supply in Waterford, as in the rest of the country, and the reason this is coming in, is tightening. And it will have an impact in terms of landlords' appetite for all of this legislation. And what is it going to do to the market? Well, we have to remember that over 75% of landlords own only 1- and 2-bedroom properties, and a lot of them are accidental landlords. And you might say, well, how can someone be an accidental landlord? Well, maybe a couple who got together and owned 2 properties, they moved into one house and then rented out the other house, or somebody left them a house. That, in that case, right, obviously some people just don't have the same appetite to rent because of all of this legislation. But in particular, the tax that landlords pay is in the region of 60%. So that means that the rent that they receive is actually treated as an income the very same way we go to work and we get our wages at the end of the week, the rent is actually treated just like our wages. So for some landlords, that rent drives their tax rate into a higher bracket, and they're paying in the region of 60% in tax. And then they have agent fees and they have service fees and they have all these different expenses. And I think until the government take a whole 360 view, obviously the security of tenure is really, really important, because in Ireland, we are so reliant on the supply of rental property from the private market. Unless we can keep the landlords in the market and make it viable for them, more landlords are likely to leave the marketplace. And that's worrying, because the supply is shrinking all the time. The stock that's on the market at the moment is worryingly low. And I guess in terms of where is it going, that is the question. So the government is doing good work to try and move towards solving the issues for tenants. And I think it is welcomed legislation, to be fair about it. But we need to look at legislation to keep landlords in the market so they have an appetite to be in it. Because without landlords, it is going to be an even more serious issue than we have today. So I'm going to have a look and see if there are any questions here. Thanks, Paul. Okay, I'll say hello. Noelle Walsh is watching. Hi, Noelle. How are you? Connor Purcell Properties is watching. Brian Kelly's watching. I'm glad Stephen's watching because he's filming it. Des Whelan from WLR, hello. Porrico Grifa, how are you? Johnny Walker. David Devine in Dublin, hi. And Ray is watching, and Marie Swith is watching. So in terms of the information, I hope you're finding it helpful. In terms of what's happening in sales, at the moment there are 748 properties for sale in the city and county. And I was just having a little brief look at the graph in terms of the last 12 months and how the activity is going. June has actually been the lowest month this year in terms of transactions. I don't know if there's any surprise there. People are in holiday mode, and I think it's possibly indicative of that. So in terms of any questions, I don't know if anybody's any questions that they might have. I'm just checking to see, is there anything that I'm missing? Look, the whole goal of this rent pressure zoning is to stabilise rents in Ireland and to stabilise rents in Waterford. And we've seen Waterford rents increase anything up to 15% in the last 12 months. And for some people, yeah, that sounds crazy. But everything is relative. Our rents and our market prices dropped. They fell off a cliff and they kept falling further and further when other markets had stopped crashing. So we actually have had a further place to come from. I mean, I knew clients who sold property in the region of 300, or bought property, in the region of 350,000. Now, there were tax breaks attached. And then at the height of the recession in 2008, those properties were selling for 10% of the price that they paid for them. So obviously you can imagine the devastation associated with that. Those properties now, in today's market, they went from somewhere at 350 they bought them for. They crashed the market 2008 down to, 30, 40,000. And today's market, they're probably selling for somewhere between 80 to 130,000, just depending on where they are and what the rent yields are. So look, I'm getting ready now to wrap up here and see, have I any more questions? No.
Darren Skelton's watching.
Hi Darren, how are you? So look, there's nothing we can do about it. It's here. Ultimately, we have to follow legislation. Tenants are not entitled to, they must get the notice. They must be given a copy of the calculation, and it's all coming back to total transparency. So, obviously, there may be landlords out there who don't operate within this scheme. They're not landlords that reputable agents would deal with, to be fair. There is a law and we must follow it. It isn't actually optional. Just one other point, rent has to stay the same for 1 full year. So if a landlord rents a property and they've put in the new calculation, the 4%, and a tenant moves in and after 3 months they move out, no, you cannot actually increase it by another 4% or use the rental price calculator. Sometimes it's more than 4% in the case where the lady had the tenant for 430 because the tenant is there 3 years and there was no increase in rent. It was more than 4%. But that rent increase is valid for 12 months. So that's it. That's a wrap. We will be taking a break for the summer and we will be back in September and we will have a number of guests on the programme. And if there's anything that you want to know in terms of rent pressure zone, pop me an email, regina@libertyblue.ie, and we will try to get back to you in the next 24 hours. If you're looking for a really good resource in terms of information, the RTB website, everything is on it. It's all there. It's fairly straightforward. If you're unsure, if your property falls within the pressure zone, just put the address in and it will tell you yes or no. So that's it for folks. And as I always say, up the data. Thank you for joining us.